Hello, and thank you for choosing to fly 10 points under the soaring choice for HeroScape Airtime. I'm your host, Big Up Bullfrog, and today we're doing things a little bit differently. For one, I am not going to talk in this voice the whole time, because that's just going to take way too long. But, welcome, folks. So today, instead of looking at a gameplay video and commentating on, the strategy and the tactics there, we're actually going to be talking about a format. This is actually the reverse draft format that I've been featuring a lot of lately on the channel. And it's a really cool format, and it's something that I wanted to talk about a little bit more in detail outside of the usual gameplay videos, where I realize that a lot of the time viewers just want to get to the action more than they want to have a full explanation about a certain format type. But I do think that this format is unique and cool enough that it warrants having an explanation video, so that if you're interested, you can watch this video and see what's going on behind the scenes of these reverse draft games. And there's still strategy in it, there's still a lot of choice that happens with this reverse draft process, and I'll try to touch on that a little bit. It won't be super in detail because I'm going to go through the reverse draft process and how it works. But I think you'll be able to kind of infer how this army matchup plays into how you're making this decision making before the game even starts. So what I've got for you here is a real life example. This is from the Vegetarian 18 versus Chris Perkins game that should be airing around the same time as this video. There will be a link in the description as soon as the video goes up, so you can watch the game that comes after this reverse draft. But since I have all of the information for how this draft worked, and I actually watched the draft happen, I wanted to take some time to show it in a visual format for people who are interested in watching how this draft works. So instead of just hearing how it went, you'll be able to have some visual to go along with that, which hopefully will be really helpful. I know it was really helpful for me. And even if we do more reverse draft in the future, which I hope I get to, then I can also link this video then. So we'll go into how the drafting process works. What happens is there's, a D20 roll first. Who gets to make an offer first, I guess, is a better way of putting it. So what happens is both players have a 600 point army. This army up here, this is the army that Vegetarian brought. The army down here, this is the army that Chris Perkins brought. They're both 600 point armies in this case. That was the format that they were going with. So they are both 600 points. But if you're looking at the armies, up here in the north, you've got Vionok Warlord, Taylor to the Kiri Warrior, Zedekron, and 4 squads of Death Knights. And then down in the south, you've got Raylan, Rise of the Valkyrie version, Miberksa, Crixus, Thorgrim, Eldgrim, Marku, 1 squad of Knights of Weston, the Mara Warriors, and 2 squads of Mesodemon Warmongers. So if you're looking at this matchup that's going on here, even though these are both 600 point armies, you're kind of thinking, Army 2 has a lot of good figures. Army 1 is a little more cohesive because the Death Knights bond with 2 of the heroes, but Army 2 has Raylan, Army 2 has Mara Warriors, Army 2 has Knights of Weston and Thorgrim, which is, even just 1 squad of Knights of Weston, it's really good. You can see that in a lot of videos that I've casted. It also has 2 squads of Mesodemon Warmongers, which are also pretty good against Death Knights, having that staying power of Exoskeleton and then 4 attack against the Death Knights. That's really strong. And so if this was just a play what you brought format, then you'd always expect, I think, Army 2 to take the win. So what reverse draft allows you to do is you get to bid down this stronger army. So what happened is you had the D20 roll. Chris won the D20 roll, and he got to make the first offer. Naturally, he wanted to play this army, but in order to try to basically bribe Vegetarian 18 into letting him play this army, he gets to choose to sit out some figures to, make the matchup look a little bit better. So Chris's first offer was to sit out Crixus and Marku. And so basically he's saying, I'll sit out these 2 figures if you let me play this army. So the matchup would now be these remaining figures against army number 1. Veggie would take army 1, Chris would take army number 2. This would be what they play. And yes, Chris would be sitting out 110 points of his army, but it's still a pretty good matchup if you're looking at the figures that are making up the army. In fact, it's a pretty strong matchup for army 2 still, because Veggie now gets a turn. He can either accept the offer and play this army, or he can make a counter offer and drop more points from Army 2 in order to play Army 2 and make Chris play Army number 1. Now it's important to note right here that Army 1 doesn't get tampered with from this point on. since Army 2 is the one that's having figures dropped from it, there will be no figures being dropped from Army number 1. Army number 1 will be being played at full strength. And so as they draft down this army, like I said, Veggie gets to make a counter offer, and what his counter offer is he actually says, okay, let's put Marku back into the army, let's drop Eldgrim. So he's dropping 10 more points total, 20-point figure for a 30-point figure. He's dropping 120 points total from the army and saying, okay, I, Vegetarian, will play this army, and you, Chris Perkins, will play this army. Now Chris, same thing, he gets the chance to either counter offer or to accept the offer. And as kind of proof to how strong Army number 2 is here, Chris does choose to make a counteroffer. He thinks Army number 2 versus Army number 1, I'm still not confident that I'll be able to win with Army number 1, and I'd rather play Army number 2 even weaker. And so his next offer is to drop Crixus Eldgrim and then also Marku again. So now he's sitting out 140 points from Army number 2 and saying, okay, I'll play this army, you play that army, and then, the process just repeats. You can make a counter offer or you can accept the offer. So in this draft process that happened, Veggie continued to drop points because army number 2 is really good. So he puts Eldgrim back in again. They do allow you to put in figures and then drop figures instead of that. And so instead of that 30 points, he needs to drop more than 30 points at this point. So he sits out one Mesodemon Warmonger. And in the online format, at least, I know there have been different takes on this, but in the online tournament that they did allow you to drop partial squads. And so in this case, the Mesodemon Warmonger is worth 32.5 points individually, and so that is still increasing the points. It's only by 2.5 points, but it's still increasing the points being dropped from the army. Chris, again, makes a counter offer. He puts the Mesodemon back, and instead he drops me Berksaw. And so now he's trying to say, I will sit Crixus, Marku, and me Berksaw in order to play this army. And you can see, the difference that's making as this goes on, as larger and larger figures are being dropped and more points. You can see how the matchup is getting closer, which is really, really cool, because you can kind of see how the armies are becoming a lot closer as far as overall power goes and dropped from army number 2. So again, Veggie makes another counteroffer. He doesn't think that the dropped figures are enough in order to let Chris play this army. So he puts Marku back in the army again, and he drops Eldgrim again. So now at this point, you've got 170 points of figures that Veggie is willing to set out from army number 2 in order to take army number 2. And Chris Perkins actually still wants to drop figures. He still wants to play army number 2. I mean, by the way, this is also a very Chris Perkins army. He is really good with these kinds of armies. So he's comfortable with his chances. And so he sits out Marku again, making the total 190 points of figures dropped from army number 2 in order for him to be able to play it. And it's at this point that Vegetarian says, okay, I think that this matchup is close enough. I mean, he might even think that he's got an advantage with this army now. With 190 points being set out, Veggie says, I'll take army number 1. Chris, you can take army number 2. We'll play that matchup. And so this ends up being the matchup. And if you want to watch how that game goes down, the video should be being released soon after this one, and there will be a link in the description as soon as it's released. But it becomes a really, really interesting and I think a really, really cool matchup going on between the Death Knights and this really strong figure hodgepodge army dealio thing. Now I should also mention that there are a lot of other things going on with the reverse draft. This was pretty basic. It was just showing you how the figures get dropped and how the process kind of goes. But there's also other considerations when you're making a reverse draft that I can't quite highlight in this format. Like here I was basically talking about just the army matchup, but you've also got other things, such as the map that you're playing on. If the map really favors one kind of figure, then you might need to drop that figure in order to play that kind of army. Like say one army has a bunch of 4th mass, and the map that you're playing on has some nice hills that 4th mass can exploit. You might need to drop like half of your 4th mass, or maybe even more, in order to get to try to play that army that can abuse that map. In fact, you might need to drop that figure altogether, but that's a cool thing about reverse draft is that you can kind of play with different kinds of maps other than your standard tournament maps, and then you have other kinds of things to consider, such as what kind of army am I better playing at? I know some players would be more comfortable playing this Death Knight army with the bonding, and some other players would be more comfortable playing this Raylan pod army with tons of good figures, even though your order markers have to be more spread out. There are also tactics like trying to bait your opponent into drop too many figures from the army that they want to play. There's a lot of, subtle mind games that can happen, And there's a lot of things that nuance the draft process. And so I definitely recommend, if you haven't tried it out, to, give it a shot. It's a really cool format to play. It's one that I want to play more, and I think you'll enjoy it. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. Hopefully this made sense. If you have any questions beyond this, if I forgot to explain anything, please let me know, and I will get those answered as soon as I can. Please stay tuned for the matchup video that's going to be coming soon. It's a good one, and always, always, always remember, what a glorious world we live in. Tons of warm, happy feelings and fuzzy vibes flowing your way. Remember, there's always goodness that you can find in the world, and goodness that you can bring into the world. Kinda wish True was here to cut me off from all of this nice sappy stuff, but since he's not, we'll just leave it at that. This has been 10 warm fuzzy points, under and out.